Hi folks, lecture 12. This one is on Monopoly, not the board game, but the market structure. So let's talk a little bit about what Monopoly looks like in terms of the features. In the strictest sense, if we have a monopoly, we'd only have one firm. But sometimes there's an industry that's dominated by one firm. There may be some other players in the industry, but maybe those players aren't really big enough to pose a challenge. So we might even say that in a case like that, even though there's more than one firm in the industry, that would be a monopoly if you've got, like, let's say one firm that has 90% of the market. Okay, size of firms. Obviously, if you have only one firm, it's going to be very large relative to the market, and it would dominate the market. Types of products that you would often see in a monopoly market would be unique, no close substitutes. If there were close substitutes, then it would be hard for this monopolist to maintain his dominance. Firms control over price considerable to complete. If they're an absolute monopolist, then they could charge whatever they think is the best price for them. Conditions of entry, like how easy is it to get into the market? Well, if you've got a monopoly firm, we believe that it's going to be very difficult to be completely blocked. After all, if other firms could come into the industry easily, then it's not likely that this monopolist would be able to keep the industry all to himself. Now, under monopoly, we've got regulated and unregulated monopolies. So, for example, we talk about unregulated monopolies. Microsoft used to be a monopoly in all computers. Now, Microsoft is the dominant player in business operating systems. There was a time back in like 1998, for instance, where Apple was on its deathbed and Microsoft had 98% of the computer market, both business and personal. Today, that's not the case, but Microsoft is still dominant when we talk about like networked operating systems in offices and places like that. Google is next to a monopoly in search. I believe that Google has something like 92 or 94% market share when it comes to search. These are examples of industries that are not regulated by the government. Other types of, you'll find monopolies in other types of industries like utilities. So, for instance, in most parts of the country, you can only buy your electricity from one electric company, and that electric company is usually regulated at the state level. Like here in California, here in San Diego, we can buy our electricity from SDG&E. That doesn't mean that SDG&E can charge whatever they want. They have to go to an agency called the Public Utilities Commission whenever they want a rate increase, and they've got to run it by them. Another example of a regulated monopoly was back before it was broken up in 1983-84. There was only one phone company in the United States that controlled every single phone call made by people in businesses. That was AT&T. So they controlled not only long distance but landline service, and they were regulated by the federal government because they basically had a nationwide monopoly. All right, now why do we care about monopolies? Because when we think about an economy providing us with the greatest amount of good, or a thing called the invisible hand, which came from the father of economics, a guy named Adam Smith. Um, we can feel pretty good in a market structure that is not dominated by one firm. We can feel pretty good in believing that we don't really need the government to regulate the economy. In other words, competition will take care of itself. Now, I'm going to take a little time to talk about Adam Smith, the father of economics. One of the things that I think is pretty interesting is he's known for this famous quote: virtue is to be feared more than vice because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience. The reason I think this is a pretty interesting quote is because I think what we've all of us have probably met somebody that is kind of holier than thou. And what this quote is basically saying is, those people, those virtuous people, are to be feared more than people who maybe have aren't quite as holier than thou, because they don't have anything to feel guilty about. Whereas if you have a conscience and you're doing things that are wrong, eventually your conscience will catch up to you, and that will maybe change your behavior. But if you are doing only quote unquote good things, then nobody's there to regulate you essentially. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. It's kind of considered the founding document for economics. And he believed in a thing called the invisible hand. And the idea behind the invisible hand is that you don't need God or government to tell people what to do. In terms of a market, the market will regulate itself. Now, that's fine when we talk about perfect competition, but when it comes to market structures like monopoly, which we're going to talk about now, and oligopoly, which we'll talk about in a couple other lectures, this may not apply. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what are the sources of monopoly. So one example would be control over a key natural resource. So for the longest time, Alcoa had a monopoly, not only a nationwide monopoly, but a global monopoly in aluminum because they controlled bauxite, which is a raw material that aluminum is made out of. So every time they found a bauxite mine somewhere, Alcoa would go in there and buy it up so that nobody else would have access to that raw material, and they could continue supplying their aluminum smelters anywhere where they were located. Another one is a thing called declining economies of scale or declining long run average total cost. This is the reason given for giving all the electrical power generation and distribution to one company. We economists believe, or at least some economists believe, that the industry of electrical power generation and distribution is characterized by natural monopolies. We can actually get to a lower price for consumers by giving the entire industry to one market. We'll talk about that later. Another source of monopoly would be if there are what are high barriers to entries. So what do we mean by that? A barrier to entry is anything that you can throw up after you've started your business that would prevent other people from coming in and competing with you. So one example of a barrier to entry might be brand. If you build up a brand, it could make it very hard for other people, even if they have the ability to come into the market and compete with you. So like the example I like to use is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a brand. It's not really that hard to make fizzy, sweet soft drinks. We could probably figure out how to make Coca-Cola itself just by reverse engineering it. But what we don't have is a brand. We don't have the ability to get into stores. Even if we could convince one or two stores to take in our Coca-Cola, it might not sell very well because nobody knows what it is. So we're up against that's a barrier to entry that we'd be up against if we try to get into the soft drink industry. Or another one might be technology. I mean, some companies have um, developed a high degree of technology or expertise in a certain technology, and going up against them would be very hard. Another one would be high switching costs. So, for example, there are companies that have um, gotten other businesses, let's say, or people to use a particular technology or a particular product. And then when people, even if people don't like it all that much, they start thinking about what it would take to switch away from that. Like, I don't know, I think more and more cell phones are an example of this. You have, let's say, Verizon, and maybe you're not happy with Verizon or something, and then you start thinking, okay, well, who can I go to? And say, well, I can go to AT&T, but then you think of all the things that you might have to do, swapping out hardware, your friends and family, what all the people on your calling plan and everything else, and you just say it's not worth it. Another example of a barrier to entry would be IP, which stands for intellectual property. So if you have patents or trademarks or anything that would prevent other people from coming into the industry after you've established yourself, that could make it very hard for competitors to come into the industry. Now, are monopolies illegal? And I ask this question in my face-to-face classes, and I often get answers that yes, they are. I mean, the government regulates it. Well, that's not entirely true. Monopolies under our system are not illegal. It's just that if you have a monopoly, you have to play by a different set of rules. In fact, the government actually creates monopolies. And you say, well, how do they do that? Well, one way they do that is by setting up the system of patents, trademarks, copyrights, those kind of things. What they do is, as long as you hold, let's say, something like a patent, you have the exclusive right to make that product, let's say for 17 years for a normal product and 22 years for, let's say, a drug, a medical drug or something like that, because it's got to go through the approval process. So that could be enough time to give a company a monopoly. Another example of government policy creating monopoly would be, not that you want to go into the post office or anything like that, but you couldn't even if you wanted to. If you wanted to deliver letters to people's homes, you are not allowed to do that. The only entity that can do that is the United States Post Office. Or at the local level, you find that utilities or even cable TV have carved up different geographical areas. Well, who gave them the right to do that? Local governments did that, local and state governments. So monopolies in and of themselves are not illegal. They just have to play by a different set of rules, and we'll talk about that when we get to antitrust. And then finally, another source of monopoly would be what are called network externalities. So the idea behind network externalities is that there's some kind of a network, and there's a benefit to being part of that network. And the benefit of being part of that network grows as more and more people come into the network. So, for instance, Facebook. I mean, there's nothing stopping anybody from setting up their own social media company. But since everybody's on Facebook, one of the problems that you would have, let's say if you wanted to set up your own social network, is convincing people to come over to your new social network. Well, why should anybody leave Facebook once they're on there? All their friends, everybody else they know is on Facebook. So what that does is that makes Facebook more and more valuable to people, and more people, of course, join. And so that assures that they're going to have more of a monopoly than if there weren't network externalities. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between monopoly and perfect competition, being that we finished perfect competition, if you're watching these clips in order. So in perfect competition, we said that the firm was a price taker and that their demand curve was a horizontal line at little p star, and their demand curve was also equal to the marginal revenue curve. And in perfect competition, we said that the firm could sell as much as they wanted, as long as they're willing to take P star. And what the firm would do is look to the point where marginal cost is equal to the demand curve, which is P star, and that would determine the quantity. Well, a monopolist doesn't face a horizontal demand curve. The demand curve for a monopolist is the industry demand curve, which is downward sloping. If it has a downward sloping demand curve, that means it has a separate marginal revenue curve that is below the demand curve. In other words, as it starts lowering price to get more and more people to buy the product, its marginal revenue would go down. Now, this is going to be important because we're going to look at the output decision, or how the monopolist goes about determining how much it should supply the market. So under monopoly, I mean, one of the things that we might suspect is that the monopolist might choose to produce where the industry's marginal cost curve intersects a demand curve. So why might we think that might be a possibility? Remember when we were in perfect competition, we talked about how if we summed up all the marginal cost curves belonging to individual firms, we would get to the industry marginal cost curve, and the industry marginal cost curve would be the supply curve. Since we're talking about monopoly, we're talking about one firm in the industry. It's going to be facing the industry demand curve, which we said was downward sloping. It's going to have a separate marginal revenue curve, which is going to be downward sloping as well, below the demand curve. And its marginal cost curve, since it's the only firm in the industry, is going to be the industry's marginal cost curve. So if we were thinking about supply and demand, it would be where the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. However, what we have to remember is that in monopoly, there's only one firm supplying the industry. They are not obligated to supply the same quantity at the same price that we would get in a competitive market. Does that make sense? All right, so then that leads us to thinking about other pricing strategies for this monopolist that has the entire market to themselves. I suppose they could price up here at P high. At P high, they would be selling Q low. That's one possibility, but it turns out that that's probably not a good pricing strategy because they would be making an economic profit, but it doesn't look like they'd be making much of an economic profit, right? If they price at P high and average total cost is a little bit below P high, then they're making a very small economic profit. Another thing that they could do if they were the nice monopolist is they could supply a quantity I'm going to call Q medium. That's where the monopolist marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. That would probably even get them a bigger economic profit. Why do we say that? Because if this is the price P medium and this is average total cost a little bit below that, it's actually bigger than they would, a bigger economic profit that they'd be able to make compared to pricing at P high. But the firm is not obligated to do that. And then finally, I guess they could maybe decide to be really, really nice and price at P low and sell a quantity of Q high. But that doesn't really make sense either because the price is below their marginal cost curve and it's certainly below its average total cost as well. So they would be losing money. I don't think they would that would be the pricing and output strategy that they would employ. So what we're going to do is we're going to think in marginal terms. And what we believe the monopolist is going to do is compare marginal revenue to marginal cost. When we were in perfect competition, we said that the perfectly competitive firm priced at where marginal cost was equal to demand. And it turned out that because the perfectly competitive firm's demand curve was horizontal, it was also equal to its marginal revenue curve. If the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve and a separate downward sloping marginal revenue curve, and they price where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, this would give us the quantity, which we're going to call QM, that they'd be willing to supply the market. But it doesn't tell us anything about the price. So where would they go to pick up the price? They would go all the way up to the demand curve and then over here to the price axis. And what we believe the monopolist would do would be they would charge a price of PM and supply the market with a quantity of QM. So how would this compare, let's say, to the perfectly competitive output? If we had an industry that was characterized by a lot of smaller firms and we added up all their marginal cost curves, this over here would be the industry supply curve. And where supply and demand intersect, we would get the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, which we'd call QPC, perfect competition. Well, QPC is greater than QM. And then where the industry supply curve intersects a demand curve, we'd have another coordinate over here for the price under perfect competition. Well, how does that compare to the monopolist price? That is actually lower than the monopolist price. So in a case of monopoly, the monopolist is able to get a price that is higher than the price we'd expect in perfect competition, and will supply the market with a quantity that is lower than what we'd expect to get in perfect competition. All right, I'm going to end it here because otherwise this is going to be too long, and then when we come back, we will pick it up with looking at economic profit.